Good afternoon, friends, subscribers and new viewers. Today we've got another Wargames miniature unboxing. Byzantine Cataphracts. Produced by Fireforge Games as part of their Deus Vult historical range, the first impressions of this 12-figure box are good. It retails around the £22 mark, and for 12 figures this is not overly expensive. However, I'm hoping that with a few minor painting and conversion tricks, I can more than get my money's worth out of these versatile heavy cavalry. This box contains 10 sprues. These 10 sprues are 4 horse sprues, 4 rider sprues, and 2 base sprues. Now I'm really pleased with these bases. This is a big plus and I've got nothing negative to say about these. They're 25mm by 50mm and they're really suitable for most game systems. Now the 4 horse sprues, you'll note, contain 3 heads, 3 bodies in 2 halves, and 3 tails. So there isn't a huge amount of versatility here, and that's something I'm going to explore throughout this video. However, they do have a nice simple construction method, and unlike the gripping beast horses, the joint is between the head separately rather than the joint at the neck on the other side. When we look at the cataphracts themselves, we notice that there's 3 heads, 3 shields, and then 3 arms for the left side and 3 arms for the right side with spears and 3 with maces. So there's still a similarity, there's not a huge amount of options. Now assembling the horses was an absolute treat. They go together really well. The tail just plugs in the back and there's no gap or obvious mould lines down the centre across the saddle, which you do get with some figures. The head's also fitted in really nicely, and you can mix and match the heads around a little bit to get different variety in your poses. I like the rider too. I'm not hugely keen on the design of the spear tip here, or the tip of his lance, I would say. It's a little bit large, and it just doesn't quite seem to fit with a lot of my other existing spears from other manufacturers. But I like the figure himself. He's got a male aventail, this sort of veil that covers his face, and a horsehair plume on the top of his helmet. All of the riders are very similar, almost uniform. In fact, I can find very few differences between the different riders. This should make painting them quite easy, as I'll get a nice production line going. We'll have a look at this figure. I should note that these are meant to be representing the later Crusades period, and therefore they have stirrups. So anyone who's hoping to use these, as I might, for something which was a ancient or late antique army, should note that there is an anachronism in this couched lance and stirrup usage. But more on that later. Let's have a look at some of the spare pieces. So you'll note that there are 3 shields per sprue, and there are also 3 swords in scabbards per sprue. The 3 extra heads I didn't include are the ones which don't include the horsehair plume. Now note that there are 3 arms with maces and 3 arms with lances, but there isn't an arm with a sword. And when we look at these sprues, the sprues are all the same, so there's no command or musician options on here, and no obvious standard bearer or anything. Now you could use a metal figure that's matched, but there's perhaps a problem there, and I'm going to talk more about that later. Now I have an unresearched but fairly spurious suggestion that these were probably done using 3D CAD or kind of computer modelling to sculpt, rather than using a 3-up and sculpting method. And for the reason for that is these points of contact. Now, this is a negative point for me, and it's quite a big negative. However, the horses are sculpted in a very dynamic running pose, which means that they don't have hooves touching the ground, and they don't come with a small inbuilt plinth. So you have to glue on at these small, quite delicate points, which don't sort of balance very well. I've just trimmed the sprue gate off. But even so, there's only a small point of contact, and it's not on the centre of gravity, so it's actually quite difficult to glue these to their bases. This was actually quite a negative point. And I talked earlier about adding a metal commander, but that doesn't really work in the case of some of these poses, as they have their centre of gravity sort of floating in midair. Now, I've chosen to include this Angus MacBride illustration because I think it's quite obvious that that is the inspiration behind the sculpt. Now, I mentioned about getting my money's worth, and some of the game systems that I'm thinking I can deploy these in span a huge length of time. So if we look at the obvious choice, Byzantines, I've got here the Saga First Edition book. We could possibly use these Cataphracts as Hearthguards. Similarly, if we stretch our historical anachronisms and we look at this Age of Invasions book, both the late Romans and the Sassanids use heavy cavalry. So the Cataphract is a Persian military unit, and this figure, when used, bearing in mind there's not a huge amount of sort of distinguishing detail, could well make a good proxy for some of these Contos-armed late Roman Cataphracts. All you'd have to do is mix in some of the Gripping Beast cavalry and add a couple of metal commanders, and you could add and bulk out existing units of heavy cavalry using these Cataphracts. The only thing I did note earlier was the stirrups and the couched lances, rather than holding the Contos with both hands over the head. However, if we go forward in time historically, but back in time in terms of the date these rules were written, we could also look at adding these to something like a Persian army or even an Ottoman Turkish army as Sipahi. So the Spahi is a heavy armoured cavalry. The Spahi helmet's quite distinctive. It's got that male aventine, a horsehair plume, and a lance. These could be really useful for a huge range of historical periods, and that's what I'm proposing to do, to find the most versatile miniatures. These figures are quite plain, but I think that works to their advantage, and this chap may well serve for about 1,000 years of history.